I didn't know it yet, but the night my own brother slammed a door in my face was the best thing that ever happened to me. My name is Renata. I'm 31. And for a year and a half, I was paying the mortgage on a house I wasn't allowed to walk into. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how I ended up standing in a driveway on my own birthday, locked out of a house with my name on the bank statement, you have to go back 2 years, to a Sunday dinner where my parents announced they'd found the perfect property. A lake house, 40 minutes outside the city, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound deck, exactly the kind of place they'd always dreamed of retiring into. My mother's eyes were shining. My father kept saying the number like it was nothing, like money simply arrived when you wanted it badly enough. I asked, gently, whether they'd really thought through another monthly payment on top of everything else. My father waved me off. My mother told me not to worry, that they had it handled. They did not have it handled. 6 months after closing on that house, my mother called me in tears, asking if I could cover the mortgage, just for a little while, just until things settled. I said yes, because that is what you do for people who raised you, even when a small, steady voice in the back of your mind is telling you this will not be temporary. I was right not to trust that voice. Within weeks, I learned my younger brother, Desmond, had moved into the lake house full-time. Not to help with the payments. To live there while he, in my parents' words, found himself. Desmond was 26 at the time. 5 years younger than me, and 5 years behind on almost everything a grown adult is supposed to have figured out by then. He had been let go from more jobs than I could count on both hands, always for the same reasons, always described by my parents as bad luck, or a difficult manager, or a company that simply didn't appreciate him. I remembered every version of this story from our childhood. The teacher who was too hard on him. The coach who didn't understand his potential. The girlfriend who didn't deserve him. There was always a reason Desmond's failures belonged to someone else, and there was always my mother, standing between him and any consequence sharp enough to actually teach him something. I want to be honest about something most people watching this will understand instantly, even if they've never said it out loud. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the child who was never allowed to fail, because everyone assumed you could handle it, standing next to the child who was never allowed to succeed on his own, because everyone assumed he couldn't. I got my first job at 16 because my parents told me my car insurance was my responsibility. I paid my own way through college because they said they simply didn't have it to give. And now, at 31, I was quietly funding a lake house my brother lived in for free, while being told, every time I asked when he might contribute, that he just needed a little more time. A little more time turned into 18 months. 18 months of a $1,540 mortgage payment leaving my account on the 3rd of every month, without fail. 18 months of $650 sent directly to Desmond, because my mother said he needed spending money while he looked for work that never seemed to materialize into an actual job. 18 months of $600 for my parents' groceries and $890 for their utility bills, quiet, automatic transfers I barely thought about anymore, the way you stop noticing a low hum in the background of your own life until the day it suddenly stops. I told myself it was temporary the entire time. I told myself that once Desmond found steady work, once my parents adjusted to their new payment, things would balance out again. What I did not let myself think about, not fully, not honestly, was the pattern underneath all of it. Every single time in our lives when Desmond had been given a soft landing, and every single time I had been expected to build my own. When he cheated on a high school exam, my mother argued with the school until they let him retake it. When he crashed my father's car while texting behind the wheel, they bought him a new one within the month, so he wouldn't be inconvenienced. When he was arrested at 19, they hired a lawyer good enough to make the whole thing disappear. I got a part-time job. I got student loans. I got told, at 22, that it was time to stand on my own 2 feet. There's a memory that kept surfacing during that year and a half, one I hadn't thought about in years until I started sending Desmond money every month. I was 14 and he was 9, and he'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball he wasn't supposed to be throwing near the house at all. I remember standing in the kitchen while my mother rehearsed, out loud, exactly what she was going to tell the neighbor, a story that somehow made it sound like an accident nobody could have prevented. I asked her why she was covering for him instead of making him apologize himself. She looked at me like I'd said something strange, and told me some children simply need more protecting than others. I didn't understand it then. By the time I was 31, standing locked out of a house I was paying for, I understood it perfectly. By the time my birthday weekend arrived, I had stopped noticing how much I was carrying, the way you stop feeling the weight of something you've held for a long time. I planned the weekend for months. My closest friends, the lake house I had quietly kept afloat for a year and a half, one request to my brother, sent 3 days ahead of time, simply asking him to tidy the place before we arrived. The message showed as read. He never replied. I told myself that meant he was fine with it. I was wrong, and some small part of me, if I'm honest, already suspected I was wrong before we even got in the car. We pulled into that driveway on a Friday evening in early summer, and before the engine was even off, we could hear the music from inside, loud enough that the bass moved through the car doors. Every light in the house was on. My friend Odette laughed and said it looked like Desmond had started the party early. I laughed too, but something in my chest had already gone tight, that specific, familiar tightness I'd learned to recognize over the years as the feeling of a plan quietly falling apart before anyone had said a word. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked harder, using both fists, and still nothing, the music simply swallowing the sound whole. I called Desmond's phone and it rang out completely unanswered. My friends stood behind me on that porch, shifting their weight, not saying anything, the kind of silence that is somehow louder than the music inside the house. I called again. And again. On the 4th attempt, he finally picked up, sounding irritated, as though I were the one interrupting his evening rather than standing locked out of a house I had been paying for every single month for a year and a half. When the door finally opened, Desmond stood there with a drink in his hand, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes glassy in the way I recognized instantly from years of watching him drink past the point of good judgment. Behind him, the living room was packed, easily 20 people, all holding cups, all laughing, none of them looking twice at the woman standing in the doorway on her own birthday. I asked him what exactly I was looking at. He told me, without a hint of embarrassment, that plans had changed, that this was his party now, in his house, and that my friends and I needed to find somewhere else to be. I told him this was my birthday weekend, that we had discussed it days ago, that he had read my message and said nothing. He shrugged, told me I wasn't welcome there tonight, and before I could say another word, he shut the door in my face and I heard the lock turn. I stood there on the porch of a house I was making mortgage payments on, unable to get through my own front door, while 20 strangers celebrated inside without me. My friends said nothing. There was nothing kind to say. I called my mother from that driveway, certain, absolutely certain, that she would fix this within minutes. Instead, she told me, with a calm that still unsettles me when I think about it, that I should simply leave, that Desmond had every right to ask me to go. When I pushed back, my father took the phone and told me something that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. The house, he said, no longer belonged to them. They had transferred it to Desmond. It was his property now, his decision who came and went, and I needed to respect that, the same way I would respect any other homeowner's wishes. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it in that driveway, phone pressed to my ear, my friends pretending not to listen while obviously hearing every word. A house I had paid the mortgage on for 18 months, transferred quietly to the one person in the family who had never contributed a single dollar toward it, and I was the one being asked to leave, the one being told I wasn't welcome, the one apparently owed no explanation at all for a decision that had clearly been made without me. I asked my father when this transfer had happened. He told me it wasn't something they needed to discuss with me, as though I were an outside party to a decision built entirely on money I had been sending them every month. We stood in that driveway for another few minutes, my friends quietly loading bags back into the trunk of the car, none of us saying much of anything. Odette finally asked where we were supposed to go now, at 9 at night, an hour outside the city, on a weekend I had planned around this specific house. I didn't have an answer. We ended up in a roadside diner off the highway, eating pancakes at 10 at night in our nice clothes, my friends trying to make it into a joke, a strange little adventure, while I stared out the window at the dark road and felt something inside me go very still and very quiet, the kind of stillness that isn't calm at all, but the moment right before a decision. We drove back to my apartment that night in near total silence. My friends tried, gently, to salvage what was left of the evening, ordering takeout, opening a bottle of wine, singing happy birthday over a store-bought cake at my kitchen table. I sat through all of it with a strange, cold clarity settling over me, the kind that doesn't feel like anger yet, but you can sense is going to become something once the shock wears off. I kept doing the math in my head, over and over, until the numbers finally added up to something I couldn't unsee. $1,540 for the mortgage. $650 for Desmond. $600 for groceries. $890 for utilities. $3,680 a month, more than half of everything I earned, funding a family that had just made it very clear I wasn't welcome in the home I was building for them. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake replaying every phone call I'd had with my mother over the past 18 months, every time she'd thanked me quickly and then changed the subject, every time I'd almost asked when things would go back to normal and stopped myself, afraid of sounding ungrateful for helping my own family. I thought about the specific tone in my father's voice when he said the house belonged to Desmond now, how certain he sounded, how rehearsed, as though this conversation had been planned long before I ever pulled into that driveway. That thought sat with me until the sun came up, and by the time it did, something in me had already decided what came next. I woke up the next morning with a headache and a level of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I made coffee, opened my banking app at my kitchen table, and one by one, I cancelled every automatic payment tied to that family. The mortgage first. Then Desmond's monthly transfer. Then my parents' groceries. Then their utilities. It took less than 10 minutes to undo 18 months of quiet obligation. I didn't call anyone to explain. I didn't send a single message. I simply finished my coffee, went to work, and waited to see how long it would take anyone to notice. The 4 days that followed were oddly peaceful. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, watched television, did all the small ordinary things a life is made of, and noticed, almost with surprise, how much lighter each of those small things felt without the low hum of obligation running underneath them. I found myself checking my phone less, not more, the way you'd expect. Part of me wondered if they simply hadn't noticed yet, if the money had somehow kept moving without me. I knew that wasn't possible. I think I was simply enjoying the quiet before I knew for certain it was about to end. It took 4 days. My mother called at 7 in the morning, her voice sharp with panic, demanding to know where the mortgage payment was. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I was no longer paying it. When she asked why, I reminded her of exactly what she and my father had said in that driveway, that the house belonged to Desmond now, that I needed to respect his decisions, that I wasn't welcome there. If the house was his, I said, then the mortgage was his responsibility too. She called me spiteful. I told her spiteful would have looked very different from simply stopping. Desmond called next, then texted, demanding to know where his monthly money had gone, telling me he had bills to pay, as though I were the one who had failed some basic obligation between us. When I didn't respond, he showed up at my apartment building close to midnight, pounding on my door, drunk, insisting this was revenge, that I was trying to make him lose the house out of spite. I told him through the closed door that if he wanted to keep it, he was welcome to get a job and pay for it himself, the same way every other adult who owns a house manages to do. He kept pounding for a while, calling me names I won't repeat, telling the walls of that hallway exactly what kind of sister he thought I was. Eventually, a neighbor opened their door and asked what was going on, and Desmond finally left. My parents tried a few more times after that, phone calls at odd hours, long emails that alternated between guilt and anger, and finally an ambush in a parking lot near my office, where my father told me the bank was threatening foreclosure and that I needed to fix it. My mother stood beside him, asking me not to let them lose the house out of spite, as though spite were the only possible explanation for a grown woman finally declining to fund a household that had locked her out of it. I told my father I didn't need to do anything, that Desmond had been given the house, and Desmond could keep it or lose it based on his own choices, the same way every adult in the world eventually has too. I got in my car and drove away, and that was the last real conversation any of us had. The weeks after that were quieter than I expected. There were a few more messages I didn't answer, a couple of missed calls that eventually stopped altogether. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, staring at my phone, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief sitting side by side, neither one fully winning out over the other. I called an old friend from college, someone who'd known my family for years, and told her everything. She listened for a long time before saying something I've thought about often since. She said I had spent so long being the responsible one that everyone around me had simply stopped imagining I might one day stop. 6 months passed. 6 months of quiet, of a bank account that finally grew instead of draining itself dry every month, of waking up without the low hum of obligation sitting on my chest before I'd even opened my eyes. I picked up small habits I hadn't had time for in years, cooking real meals instead of takeout, going for long walks after work instead of dreading the next automatic payment date, sleeping through the night instead of running numbers in my head at 2 in the morning. I didn't think about my family every day the way I expected to. Some weeks I barely thought about them at all, and that surprised me more than anything else. I ran into a cousin at the grocery store during those 6 months, the kind of relative who has always known everyone's business before they know it themselves, and she couldn't wait to tell me the house had been foreclosed on 3 months earlier, that Desmond had moved back in with our parents, still without a job, still going out most nights, and that just the week before, he had wrecked our mother's car while driving home drunk. She asked me if I felt anything, hearing all that. I told her honestly that I didn't feel much of anything at all, and I meant it. The version of me who would have felt guilty, or vindicated, or anything in between, had quietly stopped existing sometime over those 6 months. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I mostly felt relief, the specific kind that comes from finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be yours to hold in the first place. With the $3,680 I was no longer sending out every month, I started saving for the first time in my adult life. I opened an account I didn't touch, watched it grow every 2 weeks, and felt something close to pride every time I checked the balance, a feeling I hadn't associated with money in a very long time. Last weekend, I toured my first condo with a real estate agent, a small, sunlit place with a door that will only ever open when I choose to open it. I stood in the empty living room for a long moment, imagining where a couch might go, where I'd put a small table by the window, and I thought about that porch, the music, the lock clicking shut on the other side of a door I'd been paying for. I understood, standing in that empty room, that I wasn't just buying a place to live. I was buying back the part of myself I'd spent 18 months quietly handing away, one automatic payment at a time. My family didn't just lose a house. They lost the version of me who kept showing up no matter how many times I was shown exactly where I stood. I'm not angry anymore, not really. I'm just done. Done paying for a seat at a table I was never actually given, done funding a life for people who made it clear, in a driveway on my own birthday, exactly how little I mattered to them the moment I wasn't useful. If any part of this story sounded familiar to you, I want to hear it in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like mine still to come.